Welcome back, everyone, to the Property Journey podcast, beginner to expert. Roy, nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Back for another episode.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of questions lined up. But first thing is we had a listener's question came in from Simon. Simon was wondering how best to choose a mortgage advisor.
Mortgage advisor, how to choose one. I suppose it's like choosing any tradesperson or professional. It's first of all, go on recommendations. So speak to other people who have used mortgage advisors and see who would they recommend. But most importantly, drill down into why they would recommend them. You know, it might be something that they were very fast. It might be something that they maybe explained the process a bit easier for them, or it might be the fact that they're local. So just basically, as always, go on recommendations.
100%. Simon, thank you again for your question. Hopefully that clears that little bit up for you. But today, Roy, I wanted to discuss the role of clearly a key person within conveyancing, which is your solicitor.
Yeah.
Now we've talked in this in quite detail in some aspects of the role which they carry out, some of the things that they do, such as what happens on obviously completion dates and little bits like that there. But I wanted to drill down into actually what's going on behind the scenes, all those little bits that we don't see.
There's a lot you don't see.
Because you know, when you think about it, the conveyancing process is roughly, say, 16 weeks. You know, a solicitor is obviously doing a lot in those 16 weeks since it starts to the finish, and maybe the only things we see is, you know, a certain little piece of that. So I wanted to drill down into actually what's going on. So like, what is the role of a solicitor in the conveyancing process?
So the process is the solicitor is there to act on behalf of the buyer to make sure that what they're buying or even what they're selling, that the title deeds are correct. So that means that all the history is correct, that it's properly connected to sewers, there's an access, ways are correct, boundaries, all of those things. And not only is it suitable and right for the buyer, but also if you've got a mortgage as well, it has to be right for the mortgage company, because at the end of the day, the mortgage company is putting up generally the vast majority of the money. So there's a lot of work has to be involved to go through all of that. And then it has to be bear in mind that a solicitor is dealing with many other transactions at the same time, and there's only like one wee task generally that can be done at a time. So it's really just juggling everything.
And like, because I've got my notepad down again, everyone, full of questions. Can't wait to get them all asked. But you know, how does a solicitor differ from, say, the other professionals that are involved in the process, such as estate agents or mortgage lenders, mortgage advisors? You know, how does the solicitor differ from them?
So we all have a role, but we all those roles are important and they all need to come together. So for instance, the estate agent, their role is, for instance, to match up, to marry up a buyer and a seller. And a good estate agent, even though once they have sale agreed on a property, they will continue to liaise with everybody involved to keep the transaction flowing and maybe to answer any queries. The surveyor, then their job is to go out to check the property, so as to check that you're not paying too much for the property, maybe the structure, is there damp, those sorts of things. And then your mortgage advisor, their job is basically to ultimately get you the money in place, because without that money you'll not be able to buy the house.
And so like, and probably then from a solicitor's point of view, then they're marrying all that together, and well, maybe not marrying it all together, but the information anyway, and putting it kind of together in that sense.
Yes. So there's some schools of thought whereby each industry just sticks to their own, and that doesn't technically work too well, or you know, doesn't always run smoothly. My view is that everybody should work together as a team, but most importantly to keep boundaries as to what their role is, so they're not maybe overstepping into each other's task too much. Like an example, you know, sometimes there's maybe a renegotiation of the price or something. Maybe the valuer has come in and said the price is too high or too low or what have you. You know, that's probably fed back to the solicitor. That's not really the role of a solicitor to then start negotiating prices. So that could be something that's passed back to the the specialists, who are the estate agents who to negotiate prices. Likewise, if a title issue comes in, well then that's up to the specialties of the solicitors to negotiate and discuss that.
So like and like what would the initial steps be for a solicitor? So as you say there, obviously the first steps taken by a buyer or a seller is that their house has been sold, agreed, or it's being bought agreed, depending on what side of the process that you're on. But what's the initial steps for a solicitor? Is it setting up a case? Is it...
So once a buyer and a seller have been married up, the estate agent then notifies everybody and they send out a memo of that. That at that point then instructs all the solicitors that's involved. So that instructs the buyer solicitor and the seller solicitor, and we know who's acting for who. So at that point then the solicitors start to open up their files. If they're acting for the seller, then at that point they need to start getting all the paperwork together, which is title deeds and different documents, like maybe energy performance certificate, different certificates for works that have been done to the house, things like that. And those documentation, it's not just as straightforward as, yes, I'll go and lift them and send them. That those documents are maybe sitting with a mortgage company. That could take 4 or 5 weeks for that information to come in. There's other documents that come in from local government departments. That could take a couple of weeks as well. So you're piecing that all together as a seller solicitor to then send it over to the buyer's solicitors. In an ideal world, that would all be done in one go, but we're in an industry where people want to see progress, and it's just basically it's got one touch on everything. So simply everything's just drip fed through to the buyer's solicitor, and then the buyer's solicitor, then it's their job to go through all that paperwork and to check it
and to ensure that it's right, then
make sure it's suitable to the needs of the buyer and to the lender.
And what would you so how do you go about, and this might sound like a silly question to you, but like how do you go about, say, verifying the legal status of a property, whether it's legally, say, in someone's name, or
There's a couple of ways to answer that. So generally that's the specialty of a conveyancer. You're trained and you, with your experience and with your knowledge, what to look for and what potential pitfalls to work for, to look out for. But generally we go through, there's different formats within our industry where our guides and terms and rules, whatever you want to call it, whereby that we can go through and you basically check everything off, and that's basically, if that's all checked off, that should be it. Perfect.
It's essentially what you would describe as legal, then.
Yes.
And I suppose in terms of the title deeds and ownership, because you obviously hear a lot, for some people, they'll look at me and kind of go, you don't know what title deeds are. But there's a vast majority of people or first time buyers out there that are maybe don't understand what title deeds are, maybe, what the actual ownership of the house is. How does a solicitor verify the title deeds or the ownership history? I know you had mentioned it there about the ownership history. What way does that all kind of come in? Or
well, maybe just that's a good comment to make there. Title deeds. Title deeds is a phrase that is all of the paperwork linked to the house in very simple format. All of the history of the property. So I'm not too sure what some perspection on that is for buyers, but from a legal point of view, title deeds could literally be a bundle of paper that height of documents, of all the ownership, all the certificates, all the works that's been done to the house. It's changed hands between different people. Like for instance, a new build property, the title deeds, the title pack comes in, on average is normally easily 4 or 5 inches high of paperwork. So,
and that's for a new build.
That's for the likes of a new build. Now, that could be more than that for a pre-owned house. It could be less than that. So the point I'm trying to make is it's a lot of paperwork to go through. So sometimes a buyer hears that the solicitor has title deeds and that they've arrived in on a Monday, and it's an expectation whereby, well, you've got the deeds, let me come in on Tuesday or let me come in on Monday afternoon to sign. But how long would it take a person to read 4 inches of paperwork, to go through, meticulously, methodically to check that it's all correct? Because if it's not done correct, it would have serious financial ramifications.
Because that's where, as you say there, very easily someone could think of title deeds as maybe like one page, like a certificate nearly.
Yes.
That's what it is. I get to say my name on it, and away you go. Whereas, as you're saying there, if you maybe are buying, for example, a pre-owned house that has lots of work done, maybe renovations done, things built in, upgrades been done to whether it's sewer lines or whatever it happens to be, then that's all documented, and that all comes in that pack then.
Yeah.
Which you as a solicitor have to go through and verify everything.
Yeah, and that has to be jotted into your daily workflow, which also consists of taking phone calls, meeting with clients, and just general emails, as well as doing that as well.
To go through maybe 400 or 500 pages worth of documents.
Yeah.
So, and that's a task on its own.
Yeah.
That would nearly take me the 16 weeks to try and get through. Never mind everything else in the process. And so, like, if that's the title deeds and ownership, I've also noted down there sort of the contracts and negotiations. How does the solicitor handle the contract drafting or the negotiation process?
So the contract side of things, it's up to the seller solicitor to prepare the contract, but it's a standard templated contract provided by the Law Society, and that's sent through from the seller to the buyer, and it automatically includes all the items, all the documents that need to be in place. So very simply, a contract can be signed very early on, and it's automatically, subject to what is needed. Now, a lot of solicitors in the industry probably would prefer and hold off that wee bit longer until they get to see quite a few of the documents, and then they arrange for the client, the buyer, to come in to sign. So the buyer will sign the contract. In our legal industry, that's known as an offer. So they're making an offer to purchase the property. Then the contract is released to the seller, and then the seller countersigns it, and that's then accepting the offer. Now, there's been a lot of confusion. People talk about exchanging of contracts, but an exchange of contract is an English process. It's a completely different process in England compared to here. So once a seller signs or accepts a contract, that's it. It's binding, and there's no going back at that point by either parties, by either the seller or the buyer.
So essentially, the seller wants their names on the
once they've scribbled it, that's it.
And this might again sound stupid, but what's in a contract? Like what kind of, like, is there any clauses or conditions or things that people should look out for? Is there, I know you're saying it's a basic template.
Yes, it's very difficult to explain because it's a document that naturally consists of about 20 pages of conditions. So to try and summarize that in 2 minutes is very difficult. But ultimately, it probably sets out expectations. I think that's the best way of putting it. What's the expectations of the seller? What documents they have to provide? What they have to disclose about the property? And then also from the buyer point of view, make them aware of what possibly may not be disclosed, and therefore what's their obligations and what safety checks should they be doing to keep themselves right.
That might be the next episode of the podcast. We'll just get a contract,
20-page contract,
20-page contract, and we'll go through it. Because it is interesting. Sometimes that's what I'm saying. That a lot of people sometimes get a contract set down in front of them and they'll just sign it. I've seen it done before, and I've seen the ramifications of that, which haven't been great at the end because they haven't realised what they've just signed. And as I say, for myself, sometimes you don't realise actually maybe what's in these documents. But in terms of then, because you hear about land registry as well, and from a time with yourself, it's only something that I've kind of picked up on as well. But so, like, where does land registry come into that? Because I know that as a solicitor, you have to then register. If it's the process continues, then you have to register with land registry. What do they do, and what's the role of solicitor in that?
So once a transaction completes, so as in once the keys have been handed over, at that point then the ownership needs to be registered. So it's registered at land registry. So land registry is a central body where basically every piece of property in the country is registered to. So that means they have full records of everything. So quite simply, you could pick a property and they can provide you all the information. They can give you the map for the property. They can give you the ownership, who owns it. It can give you as much information as all previous owners, what they paid for it. It lists out what rights of ways, what easements, what access is available for properties. Contains all of that, and that's generally done after the buyer has got their keys. And the time frame for that to be registered, it could be anything from a few weeks to a few months. It just depends on the workload. But it's the solicitor's role to prepare the paperwork for that registration, and then it's passed to land registry, basically just to register it.
To register it. I suppose the way that you're describing it there, it nearly looks like Google Earth. Is that kind of where I'm seeing it, where you kind of see your site sitting and the boundary lines out around it? And
coincidentally, yes, land registry has a facility, so the likes of a solicitor can log in, and we refer to it as a map overview. Now it's not as detailed as it's like Google Satellite,
yeah,
but it is simply a lined map, so you can see the property boundaries and roadways and things like that, and you can just move the map around, and then you can click on it, which then provides you more detailed information.
And I think I'm just realizing that I might have missed a couple of my questions that maybe comes before. Obviously the likes of land registry and stuff, but it was what are property searches that a solicitor takes?
So there's a couple of things. There's property certificates, which I've talked about before. So they come from two departments: the local council for that area, and then the regional property certificate from the formerly DOE is what everybody knows it as. So they will. So each of those property certificate departments will then reach out to a number of departments that they're in control of. So the likes of the council one will reach out to the building control, and they'll reach out to trading standards and environmental issues and things like that. The regional property certificate will reach out to departments such as the planners, the road service, the water service, all of those, and they pull together. There's a set number of questions, and they pull all that information together into one certificate. So for that one certificate that one person is in control of preparing, it's then sent out to maybe 10, 12 other departments. So they're waiting on those 12 departments to get that information back to that central person to then issue that certificate. So that in itself can take quite some time.
Yeah, and I just, because I remember seeing it, and I remember that we've talked about that before, but I just wanted to address that because that was something obviously that a solicitor does do. So obviously we've talked about contracts, land registry, title deeds, all that kind of stuff. But how does because I think you mentioned it before, obviously you've got your mortgage advisor, and they're advising people on probably the sums of money that they can go and borrow from a mortgage lender. But you had mentioned previously that solicitors have to be registered with mortgage lenders to be able to represent them. So like, how does a solicitor collaborate with that mortgage lender?
So a solicitor has to be on the panel for a lender. So lenders will have criteria as to what firms they want to actually act for them, and it might be something to do with the different criteria. It might be the number of transactions you do in a year. It might be something to do with how many partners you have in your company, those sorts of things. And basically what's happening, or what happens, is the bank then approves that solicitor to act for them, and it's really then there's a set of rules between what the bank expect for a property transaction. The solicitor then needs to follow those, and if there's any issues, then they must flag it up with the lender for the lender to confirm that they're happy to proceed.
Because that, and I suppose then, would you say that you would be, obviously as the transaction progresses, you would have to be in contact with that mortgage lender to let them know sort of how the process is going? Generally
not, because they give you those set of rules, and it's up to the solicitor to basically to protect the bank. So the solicitor will go through the vast majority of transactions without ever contacting the bank. But if they run into a title issue or title query, then they might want to run it past and get authority from the bank to say, listen, this is the problem. This is what we feel that the risks are. Are you happy enough to proceed? Do you think is there a risk, or are you happy? And then the bank go on ahead. Really, the only contact between a solicitor and a bank is the latter stages, which is basically requesting the money. So you have to do like a report, what's known as a report and title, to the bank, where the solicitor is signing off that everything is perfect, and then to send the money, and that can take a number of days.
Yeah, yeah. We've talked about completion dates before as well. We've gone into great detail on them. Obviously, they're decided the further on the process is. There's no point panicking about them. And obviously, the task for the solicitor is to ensure that the mortgage lender, the estate agent, and the solicitors are all on board to be able to decide that date. So obviously, once that's happened, is there like a finalization of paperwork in and around the completion date, or kind of what's the solicitor doing
within the final stages? Then the solicitor's just really pulling together the money. So it's just making sure, maybe obviously the contract signed, everybody is sitting ready. It's just, as I say, getting the money together. So if the buyer has a help to buy ISA, they need to get that applied for, or if there's a lifetime ISA, that needs to be applied for. Getting the clients deposit money in, getting their mortgage money in, ensuring that the house is insured, there's a copy of the policy there, and then releasing that over to the seller solicitor. The seller solicitor's then doing the reverse of that. They have to get a final figure from the outgoing mortgage company to make sure that whenever they get money in, that there's enough money there to pay off that mortgage.
Is there any common challenges from a solicitor's point of view that you would get within a process? Obviously, no conveyancing process is going to be plain sailing. There's obviously going to be hiccups, but is there any like real common ones? For example, can you run into problems with getting your certificates? Can you, is there boundary problems sometimes? Like, is there any challenges that you would maybe say are common?
Generally, there's a couple that have flagged up fairly recently, and that would be maybe in some some developments. There's a management company, which we can talk about another day, but that's basically a company that's responsible for looking after all the common areas, the grass areas, or what have you, in a development. And on some occasions, that management company has went bust, so they're in administration or they're liquidated. That causes a title issue, and if that's something that's flagged up or raised up, it's a matter of how do the solicitors deal with that, and there's maybe 2 or 3 schools of thought on that. We've had one recently where a house came with a 10-year guarantee, but the guarantee just wasn't actually suitable for the lender, so we had to then look about getting a new guarantee put in place. But generally, if I was to say out of 10 transactions, a good 7 should run fairly smoothly from a title point of view. You normally find if there are any bumps in the road with a transaction, it's really down to more personal issues, like maybe people having difficulties with dates. More importantly, maybe somebody, if there's a chain, that generally causes more problems than trying to get everybody lined up.
Yeah, like we discussed that previously about the chain of transactions, where if you're waiting on one person and they're slow, or not by any means their fault, but if the transaction is slowed down, the next one can't proceed, and the one after that can't proceed because you're waiting on the start of the chain.
Yeah.
And in terms of costs and fees, I don't want exact figures, because you probably can't get exact figures. Different companies or different solicitors will charge different prices, but like, is there what you would describe as a typical fee, or is it a case of you pay for what you're getting?
It's a very, very difficult question to answer. Generally, quite a few solicitors in an area would have an average price, but ultimately our industry is like any other industry. You have firms that maybe specialize in a particular field, and ultimately they're going to have they should have better trained staff, better technologies, better processes, so that all takes cost. So that's a maybe slightly higher cost that the buyer or the seller is paying for.
Because I know previously we had discussed choosing your solicitor. and obviously not deciding on the solicitor that your granny used maybe 30 years ago, because they might not be as active in the conveyancing chain. You know, your granny might have went and got her will done, but didn't get conveyancing done. They might not have the same rapport as what you would with that solicitor as maybe what she had with that solicitor. I don't know, we've discussed that in detail. So like, and that's where I was considering, you know, is it a case of, if you're going for a specialist, clearly you're going to pay for a specialist. You know, that it's like any other industry. If you've got a specialist in something, 9 times out of 10 they're going to be slightly dear, but you know exactly what you're getting.
It has to be something. It's all, and it comes back to expectations of a client. If a client is looking to simply just use a solicitor and say, right, I want you to deal with this transaction, I leave it in your hands, and just you contact me whenever you need me, well then that's all well and good, and you'd probably find that the costs of that would be fairly reasonable. But where there is a big fall down is buyers expect that costing, but yet they don't want to leave it to the solicitor just to deal with it in their time. They would like to prefer that, you know, the one-to-one, the phone calls, the emails, the updates, the contact. So naturally that is using a considerably more amount of resources. So if you phone up at the start and get a costing, you need to get a costing to say, well, is that just you doing the work? And will that include contacting me, speaking with me, meeting with me, and hitting those expectations?
More like a personalized approach as such.
Yes. So don't be, if you're choosing a solicitor simply on price, it's very, very dangerous. You need to be contacting them for what level of service that you want.
Yeah. And I suppose that's nearly again that reference it back to anything. That's what you get when you're paying for a level of expertise.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I found quite interesting was, how is technology changing conveyancing? You know, is there new applications out there? Is there, you know, different things that are happening now with processes? You know, is there portals out there? What's, you know, how's technology?
Probably there's always been technology in the industry. It's a matter of it probably hasn't been fully utilized for years. So for instance, more and more firms are starting to use case management software. So that means it's a central system. All the documents are saved there, they're populated there, they're generated there, and it's a very efficient way to actually run a business. But a considerable number of firms don't have a case management system. The industry has very recently moved towards technology. So the likes of communication between banks has now moved towards portals and emails, and requesting deeds and figures and money is all through portal systems as well. Even those documents that we talked about there, the likes of the property certificates, most councils are now on board with an online portal system where you log in and you generate that as well. So it's just really a matter of solicitors getting caught up with those processes. And thankfully, literally in the last 2 to 3 years, a lot of solicitors have moved to using more emails, whereas it used to be considerable amount of post and phone calls and things like that for communication, whereas now it's just emails. Just the difficulty is that has been a rapid change, and my opinion is some firms are struggling to adopt that rapid change.
And probably not only that as well, I suppose one way of looking at it is the influx of emails coming in. It could be quite difficult and very easily missed.
Yes.
You know, emails coming in and not realizing that they're sitting in your inbox. Nice. You know, well, and I've said this as before. You know, I actually even called social media a necessary evil. But in terms of technology, it can be quite daunting. One, two, it can be beneficial, but as well as that, it can have its, you know, its detriment.
Oddly enough, modern technology has slowed down the process. So without showing my age, I can remember training and starting out in the industry, emails were very, very rare, and most of your your communication came in by post, and it was actually quite nice. You had a big pile of post, and you worked through it, and you could see what you still had to do.
Yeah.
If you sent an email, and you maybe got a reply 12 hours later from a client, and everything kind of worked nice and smoothly and actually flowed. Whereas now, as you say, emails just literally, if you turned on my laptop at the minute, it would just constantly ping, ping. There could be easily, I could get about 200 emails in a day. So even just to sit down and go through my emails could be 6 hours gone. So it's not uncommon for something to be missed. And then if you send an email to somebody, it's basically replied to almost instantly.
Yeah.
And it's becoming from an email, which is an electronic mail, to a chat facility. And that is just consuming staff so that they're not actually spending the time on a transaction to move it forward. They're spending their time in just simply, informing.
I think I actually had this discussion, and I mean this even in a general overview. As you say there, emails become more like a chat facility, whereas previously you would have written an email with every point that you wanted to address, knowing that you get one response back and it covers everything, rather than a couple of sentences here and a couple of sentences there, and the chain keeps going.
Yes.
As you say, if you were going to send a letter, think of an email like sending a letter. It's and that's the difficulty with modern society now, is that everything's instant, and I think sometimes we kind of forget what's going on maybe on the other side of that expectation. People are still working, people are trying to get things done. There's only enough hours in the day to be able to try and do that. What would be your advice for a buyer? What would be your advice for a seller, from a solicitor's point of view?
From a solicitor's point of view, definitely from a buyer, is definitely be cautious to pick what solicitor, first of all, to make sure that they suit your needs and your desires, and then trust them fully. It's not like, to put it into context, a lot of people choose a solicitor by price, so they'd phone round and they just expect everybody to do the same and they get a price. But then there could be quite a few phone calls and emails between the buyer and the solicitor wanting to know what's going on. So if you compare that to bringing in a painter, yes, a painter can paint a room and they're going to give you a price for it, but then are you then going to bring the painter in and say, right, well, I want to know where are you getting the paint from, and I'll phone up the supplier to see when are you going to get the paint, and you've painted that bit there, why have you only used that, and basically taking up their time to explain what they're doing. It's going to slow that all down. So if it's slowing it down, it's taking them longer, it's not going to be as profitable for them. Whereas if you bring in a tradesman, you go on expectations, you go on recommendations to suit what you need. They're coming in, they're going to do the job, you trust them, and that's it, done.
Yeah.
And then so that's from a buyer. From a seller point of view, is probably the best advice is get speaking to the solicitor very, very early in the transaction, if not before. So if you're getting the house prepared for sale, speak to your solicitor then, and you can sit down with your solicitor and say, right, I'm thinking about selling my house, it's going on the market. The solicitor can get the title deeds applied for, which normally take 4 or 5, 6 weeks. That speeds that up. They can sit down with you and say, right, well, what have you done? Have you done any work to the house? Have you changed the boiler? Have you put an extension on? Right, well, you're going to need this paperwork, these certificates, and that's all done. So literally, it's what's known as front loading, so that once the house has gone through the bidding process and the agreed stage, it literally means the solicitor sitting with all the paperwork ready to go. Similar
to, as I think you described it as if you're looking to buy a house, speaking to a mortgage advisor,
that's all the things that you need to do to front load that, and likewise, yes, the seller needs to front load it.
The final question then is future trends. Do you see the role of solicitors changing in conveyancing? Do you see any maybe changes in the industry surrounding kind of the conveyancing process? Is there any challenges?
Well, firstly, challenges at the minute would be staffing. So there's a shortage. There's a massive shortage at the minute, and the role is very complex. It's made up of so many moving parts that to bring somebody in new to train them, it's an incredibly long process and takes a lot of time. So there's a lot of investment in time by a company. Traditionally, the industry was built with secretaries, but there's no secretaries being trained nowadays. There's no training courses. There's no tax and things like that. So there's fewer and fewer people coming in to the industry, and then with that, there's been a change in technology. There's quite a big evolution of technology, and it's a matter of whether the current staff in the industry are willing to evolve. And then the third challenge is basically workload and the stress. It comes back to it's all about the expectations of the client. In the industry, there's a lot of people, a lot of buyers and sellers getting too heavily involved in the transaction without putting trust in their solicitor, simply because they're not being patient enough. So that's putting a lot of pressure and a lot of stress on companies, on solicitor firms.
And to try and work under that is difficult enough. Do have a load of cases, for example, or processes or transactions that are currently ongoing, to then have the added stress of people consistently asking what's going on, and you can understand it as well, especially if you're a first time buyer, you maybe haven't went through the process before, you maybe do have questions. But as you say, if you had an email that had a list of 12 questions, it's easier to go through 12 questions than to deal with one, and then 20 minutes later deal with another, and 20 minutes later deal with another question. Very easily you could look at them, and within 10 minutes you've replied to all the questions, and bang, it's done and dusted. And again, I think it is that instant response, that instant I need to know, the information and the knowledge now is so readily accessible that sometimes people don't realize that this is your job. You know what you're doing. You've done it now for many years. I do this on a daily basis. I know kind of what I'm doing, and I know how to do it. And as I say, that someone in your perspective has seen everything, so you already can see it, and how it's going to pan out. So it will get done. Yeah,
and that's why I've identified this trend and the difficulty, and I've invested thousands, probably tens of thousands, in software over the last 5-6 years. My team are always shouting at me because I'm always, how can we make this better? How can we improve it? How can we make the workload easier for the team? I always say to the team all the time, how can we work smarter, not harder? And we've went through maybe 2 or 3 different softwares over the last couple of years, going from having software specifically built to suit our workflow, and it's made a massive improvement. And then likewise, the clients can log in and they can see at each stage where we have completed.
Yeah. And again, it's a positive aspect for technology, but at the same time, there is detrimental effects to it as well. It's finding the right balance. Yeah. And as you say, it probably does come back to trusting your solicitor to do the job that they're meant to be doing. Yeah. Well, that's all my questions for this week.
Thank you, Chris.
There's your bi-weekly or weekly grilling. Over the next couple of weeks, as we've already discussed, we're hoping going to get a couple of guests in. We got to grill them. Hopefully shortly we'll have them on the podcast as well. We're just working on the details of that. But for now, thank you all for listening again. Thank you, Roy, for giving your brilliant answers as always. And we shall be back shortly with the next episode.